All right, kids, if you want to learn about the game of life, forget the game of life. Play Uno. These cards will teach you about priorities, show you who your real friends are, and while playing Uno, nobody can claim that they don't see color. So many lessons despite the fact that, no matter who you are, you're playing Uno wrong. If someone puts down a draw 4 stated the Uno Twitter account, you must draw 4 and your turn is skipped. You can't put down a draw 2 to make the next person draw 6. We know you've tried it. There's even a name for this. It's called stacking, or applying negative consequences to an already negative card and passing it on to the next player. That's how you can end up with the doomsday scenario of having to pick up 24 cards and miss a turn. You should know that instead of acknowledging the rules or even reading the instructions, people would rather argue with the good people over at Uno on social media and tell the creators of the card game that they're playing it wrong. Something else I learned, just because you know better doesn't mean you're gonna switch up and see things differently.
I have spent 30 years of my life as a civil rights attorney. There is no systemic discrimination. There is no institutionalized racism in America. Jim Crow ended with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Civil Rights Act of 1965. They talk about racism. I'm a civil rights attorney. I know what systemic racism is. It does not exist in Chicago, in LA, in Baltimore. When the people running the show are black people, brown people, chief of police. Systemic racism doesn't exist, except in the minds of Democrats. You see, the Democratic playbook is from 1960. You talked about crime in Democratic cities. They run the city, but there's still systemic racism, still systemic discrimination, because it's the only card they have. It's the manipulation and the mindset that really the left-wing media has still control over the public, thinking that people are being denied opportunities because of skin color. Harris, that doesn't exist. Look at you, look at me, look at this country. Is this country more diverse now than it was 30, 40 years ago? You don't need to answer that question. It's obviously yes. We have people of all colors in every aspect of government. Oh, by the way, we had a black president.
That was Leo Terrell, who should know better. He's a civil rights attorney, along with a conservative correspondent and major contributor to the, well, a black person agrees with me thing, claiming that the race card is used by Democrats to divide us, but also Dems running the show in large cities is proof that there can't be systemic racism, meaning because he can see minorities in power, systemic racism doesn't exist because there are no racist laws, which is what we're going to talk about today. But before I continue, is Terrell sure that there's no longer any systemic racism since Jim Crow ended?
Using race to punish white Americans is illegal under the Civil Rights Act of 1960.
Affirmative action, a policy, a law, was racist against white people or Asian people. Uno reverse, I guess. Pretty sure that white students at Harvard were fine though. Anyways, even though I'm stacking up a bunch of draw 2s and draw 4s to drop on him at once, this isn't just about Leo Terrell. I've seen and heard many in his position say the same thing. Here's Candace Owens saying in an interview, quote, "There is no systemic racism. There is no law. There is nothing that says I cannot do something as a black person that you can do, so it's completely false." Before saying in the very next paragraph of this article, if there's anything systemic in America today, it is white guilt. So while we're going to focus today on land acquisition and housing, along with the criminal justice system, the US has used more than just laws to be systemically racist since the beginning. Let's start with the 1790 Naturalization Act that permitted only free white persons of good character to become naturalized citizens, thus opening the doors to European immigrants, but not others. Only citizens could vote, serve on juries, hold office, and in some cases, even hold property. White was also associated with Christian, by the way. The 1830 Indian Removal Act forcibly relocated Cherokee, Creeks, and other eastern natives to west of the Mississippi River to make room for white settlers. The 1862 Homestead Act gave away millions of acres of what had been native territory west of the Mississippi. In all, 270 million acres, or 10% of the total land area of the United States, was converted to private hands, overwhelmingly white. The Federal Housing Administration, operated through the New Deal's National Housing Act of 1934, allowed millions of average white Americans to own a home for the first time. Down payment requirements were reduced from as much as 50% to 10 or 20%, and the time to pay off the remaining mortgage was extended from 5 years to 30 years. Federal investigators evaluated 239 regions for risk. Communities with a mere 1 or 2 black families were pretty much deemed financial risks, ineligible for low-cost home loans. Government appraisal maps colored those communities red, hence the origin of the term redlining. Between 1934 and 1962, the federal government backed $120 billion of home loans. More than 98% went to white people. Of the 350,000 new homes built with federal support in Northern California between 1946 and 1960, fewer than 100 went to black people. And the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, better known as the GI Bill, was signed into law only weeks after the D-Day offensive began. It ushered into law sweeping benefits for veterans, including college tuition, low-cost home loans, and unemployment insurance. In 1947, only 2 of the more than 3,200 VA guaranteed home loans in 13 Mississippi cities went to black borrowers. These impediments were not confined to the South. I've talked about this thread of laws and policies in a previous video on the US government giving handouts to white people. I bring them up here to show that even before the Jim Crow era, legislators didn't always mention skin color when doing racist stuff either. Now, to be clear, these policies were race conscious for the sake of European Americans, whether explicitly or implicitly, whether intentionally or not, and gave white people not just access to land and housing, but banking, loans, and public education by extension. These policies denied these same benefits and privileges to black, brown, and native people, minorities in general. However, seeing how those many yet brief, non-detailed examples occurred before the Civil Rights Act of 1965, based on what was claimed earlier, they don't count. Skip, or something like that. Blockbusting restrictive covenants and racist deeds outlawing homes being sold to black people were made illegal with the Fair Housing Act of 1968. During that same year, President Lyndon B. Johnson announced that the government would extend its pro-home buying policy, including federally insured loans, to low-income purchasers. The hope was that a new core of inner-city folk, gassed up by the pride of home ownership, would fix up neglected properties and activate urban renewal from within. The new program would accomplish this through Section 235. The private sector would provide the real estate agents, appraisers, mortgage brokers, and financing, while the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, which was created to make affordable housing available to all, would oversee the process. It was a private, profit-making partnership. Well, by 1971, owners found that the homes had more than the cosmetic problems that they previously reported, including faulty plumbing, leaky roofs, cracked plaster, faulty and inadequate wiring, rotten wood in the floors, staircases, and porches, lack of insulation, and faulty heating units, according to a HUD report. Quote, about 1/4 were in such poor condition that investigators concluded that they should have never been insured, wrote Keeanga Yamada Taylor in her PhD dissertation. By the end of 1973, 10% of Section 235 homes were in foreclosure, along with tens of thousands more in other FHA-assisted low-income home ownership programs. In May of 1974, HUD was in possession of 78,000 single-family homes that had been foreclosed upon. With that said, Nixon shut the program down in 1973, and wrists were slapped. Some were placed in handcuffs. You can pause to read this account of the consequences or lack thereof for such discrimination, bias, and inequality if you want. But I want you to hear the excuses made as to why race wasn't a factor in the housing crisis.
HUD produces a pamphlet explaining to the inhabitants of public housing how you clean a house, right? And all of these white congressmen who are engaging in this ridiculous conversation know how black women clean houses because they've got black women cleaning their houses. But somehow black women only know how to clean other people's houses and not their own.
So that was Keeanga Yamada Taylor, again, whose research presented everything I just talked about with housing and urban development and Section 235 in her book, From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, also breaking it down during lectures and interviews. So the policy in and of itself didn't say the real estate industry is going to undermine black home ownership, but that's what it did. This system didn't claim to discriminate against and disenfranchise the likes of a black woman named Janice Johnson, but it did. We know what housing means to building equity, generating wealth, and passing it on to the next generation. But even President Richard Nixon said, people who own their own homes don't burn down their neighborhoods. Keep this in mind for later. Let's jump from Tricky Dick's presidency to the Reagan administration, which would go on to accelerate the war on drugs. The Anti-Drug Abuse Acts of 1986 and 1988 established the 100-to-1 ratio. This had to do with the amount of crack versus powder cocaine necessary to trigger mandatory minimum prison sentences, meaning that possession of 5 grams of crack cocaine would mandate the same minimum sentence as 500 grams of powder cocaine. The most recent government statistics available show that in 2005, African Americans constituted more than 80% of those sentenced to federal prison for crack cocaine offenses. Even though 2/3 of crack cocaine users are Hispanic or white, Black and white people use and sell drugs at similar rates. But based on what we're told, since those policies didn't say target Black and brown people in the inner city and be lenient towards white people, these laws aren't racist. Oh, and if someone says Black people wanted anti-drug policies and just say no messaging, do you still think it's racist? Yes. Yes. Don't forget, prejudice plus power equals racism. Black people didn't have the means to issue the war on drugs. Former US Senator Joe Biden and former President Bill Clinton used a wild card with the crime bill, but chose not to switch skin colors, while putting more police officers on the streets, providing a lot more money to build prisons, and bringing harsh penalties for felons. Then there's the stop and frisk policy in New York City. I should really look into the stand your ground laws, by the way. And in the 40-something years since the beginning of Reagan's first term in office, the prison population exploded. Penitentiaries were filled with Black men. Well, just a few years ago, Stanford University researchers put together the most comprehensive evidence to that date, suggesting there is a pattern of racial disparities in traffic stops. Using traffic stop data they got through public records requests, the largest such data set ever collected, which points to pervasive inequality in how police decide to stop and search drivers. The Stanford Open Policing Project examined almost 100 million traffic stops conducted from 2011 to 2017 across 21 state patrol agencies, including California, Illinois, New York, and Texas, and 29 municipal police departments, including New Orleans, Philadelphia, San Francisco, and St. Paul, Minnesota, according to NBC News. The results showed that police stopped and searched Black and Latino drivers on the basis of less evidence than used in stopping white drivers, who are searched less often but are more likely to be found with illegal items. Furthermore, the largest ever study of alleged racial profiling during traffic stops has found that Black people, who are pulled over more frequently than white people by day, are much less likely to be stopped after sunset when, quote, a veil of darkness masks their race. I've also talked about this before. I gotta add that after weed was legalized in Colorado and Washington state, there has been a reduction in searches of both white and minority drivers, but the search rate remains twice as high for minorities. So passing a law could help with bias and discrimination, but it's not enough. The point is, even if a law was or wasn't systemically racist, the enforcement of it can be and is. We also see this in sentencing.
An analysis of Florida's death penalty cases seemed to reveal no racial disparity in sentencing between Black and white defendants convicted of murder. But dividing the cases by the race of the victim told a different story. In either situation, Black defendants were more likely to be sentenced to death. The slightly higher overall sentencing rate for white defendants was due to the fact that cases with white victims were more likely to elicit a death sentence than cases where the victim was Black, and most murders occurred between people of the same race.
That clip was from TEDx describing Simpson's paradox, or the base rate fallacy, and how there can be a lurking variable in data. So, if we're talking about disproportionate police killings by race and somebody says, well, Black people commit so much crime that it increases their interactions with police. As you just saw, police stops aren't created equal. Even with that, this article from the Boston Globe explains Simpson's paradox best. I'll include a link to it in the description below. My favorite part was when talking about the inflated number of non-lethal encounters Black people experienced due to racial profiling. Quote, using one kind of discrimination, over policing, to mask another, the greater use of deadly force against Black suspects, Simpson's paradox predicts these counterintuitive results whenever data is averaged over inconsistent group sizes. When looking at crime, maybe instead of what appears to be a race or culture issue could be seen through the number or rate of people who are unhoused or finding it difficult to pay rent, like Nixon alluded to earlier, or being without a job or finding it difficult to get one.
So looking first at the outcomes for white testers, we see that about 34% of whites with no criminal record received a callback or job offer, compared to just 17% of whites with a criminal record. So we see that a criminal record reduces employment opportunities by about 50%. In the case of black testers, 14% of those with no criminal background received a callback or job offer, relative to just 5% of blacks with a criminal record. But the most surprising finding was really related to blacks with no criminal background relative to whites with a felony conviction. We find that a white applicant with a felony conviction fared just as well, if not better, relative to a black applicant with a clean record. This suggests that being black in America today is essentially like having a felony conviction in terms of one's chances of finding employment. About 12% of young black men are incarcerated at any given time, compared to less than 2% of young white men. About 1 in 3 young black men will spend time in prison at some point during his lifetime. And for young black male high school dropouts, that figure is close to 60%. So incarceration is becoming an increasingly common event in the life course trajectory of young disadvantaged men.
Across 21 studies representing 55,000 plus applications submitted for 26,000 plus positions, black applicants were called back 36% less than white applicants with the same qualifications. And for the Leo Terrells of the world, not a single study found a reliable anti-white bias. You should know that the rate of discrimination is the same as it was in the 1980s, per Scientific American. If employment is a system, and it is, then there's another example of systemic racism. Therefore, we see systemic racism in employment, and if this racism in resumes, recruitment, and hiring isn't based on a law, it isn't, then why do I have to explain this again? I've talked about this before too, and the responses I got back were people telling me that black folks should avoid naming their kids a certain way instead of acknowledging that black people shouldn't have to. You may have noticed that I haven't defined systemic racism or explained what it means in order to debunk this idea about racist laws. Whether you agree with me or not, I didn't want to insult your intelligence. Admittedly, I use systemic, institutional, and structural racism interchangeably, and that's wrong. However, Section 235, the Stanford Veil of Darkness study, and black-sounding names and resumes may be examples of each, respectively. I can see someone thinking or even saying, well, maybe instead of a law or systemic racism, maybe black people's problem is a lack of personal responsibility. And like, okay, even if you did feel that way, go back towards the beginning of this video to see who got free stuff from the government and what behavior of theirs led to it. With all of that said, sorry, another game that can teach you about the game of life. But I don't know where the there is no systemic racism because there are no racist laws argument even came from. I know it's not going away, and I can kind of guess why the likes of Leo Terrell, Candace Owens, and David Webb, there's another one, say stuff like that. Please know that as a black man in America, one more thing that I've learned from Uno is that just because someone else is holding all the cards doesn't mean they're going to win, especially if we're playing the game by the rules. So, Uno out, or whatever. Is it even necessary to say that before the game's over? I should look that up. We're gonna be all right.
I'm sorry, baby. So sexy.